My name is Adam Blackwell. I'm Vice President, International Development Services Group. And on behalf of the team at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, I'll be moderating this session. This is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism, counterterrorism. The views expressed are those of the presenter. Don Rassler is an assistant professor in the Department of Social Sciences and the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Combating Terrorism Center, CTC, at the U.S. Military Academy. His research interests are focused on how terrorist groups innovate and use technology. Very appropriate given the horrific incidents starting on the 7th of October. In his role as a Director of Strategic Initiatives, Don manages special projects and important center relationships, including with GTAC, I hope, and provides advice to the CTC Director about the growth and development of the center. Don has conducted counterterrorism-focused assessments for headquarters staff and advised operational units in overseas environment. He is the author of multiple books and articles and has presented and worked with many of the well-known media organizations in the United States. Don will speak for about 20 minutes, and we will then have about 20 minutes for discussion. Please prepare your questions in advance and enter them into the Q&A function in Zoom. Thank you very much, Don. Over to you.
Thanks, Ambassador Blackwell, and to Sammy and other members of the GTAC team for setting this up, and thanks to all of you for making time for this discussion today. As Ambassador Blackwell mentioned, I will provide about 15 to 20 minutes of remarks, and then open up to a question and answer session discussion with all of you. This works better as a conversation. And so my goal is just to share provide an overview of a report that I recently wrote and that was released by the Combating Terrorism Center in August of 2023 called The Compound Era of U.S. Counterterrorism as a way to kickstart this conversation. The report focuses on three things. The first is that it makes the case that the United States should frame the current moment as the compound era of U.S. counterterrorism. And it walks through a rationale for why that type of framing is useful and would be beneficial to the United States and its partners at this time. The second thing that the report does is that it focuses and explores key trends that have been shaping the worlds of extremism, terrorism, and counterterrorism over the past 5 to 10 years. The third thing that it does is, as a result of the discussion focused on terrorism trends, is that it explores some of the implications of those trends, and it recommends 11 different focus areas or priorities for the United States government to focus on as it navigates this new period or era that it finds itself. Before I jump into the meat of the report, I'd like to share a little bit about why I wrote the report. And there are three particular reasons. The first is that the United States government for the past decade, five years or so, has been navigating an inflection point when it comes to counterterrorism. All of us in the counterterrorism community understand that we've been navigating this moment, and that the counterterrorism has been less of a priority. It's still an important priority. And so the counterterrorism community in the US has been really thinking about and trying to figure out what counterterrorism looks like during this period. And so I thought the report and the suggested framing would be useful to help us navigate the moment and to help drive change across the U.S. government when it comes to counterterrorism in terms of helping us to meet the moment and also prepare and evolve towards future threats and our ability to meet those as well. The second reason why I wrote the report is because in looking at the issue of terrorism trends, I felt as though there was a bit of a gap that we could potentially help to fill or at least spotlight from CTC. There's been a lot of great work that's been done over the past 5 years or so across the academic and research community to highlight and identify specific trends that are shaping the worlds of extremism and terrorism and counterterrorism. All of that research is tremendously helpful, and as a result, those of us who are, operate in the terrorism studies or counterterrorism world are aware or have a better familiarity for what those trends are. But I felt as though in looking at that literature base is that there was a lack of developed work that tried to aggregate or to analytically situate those trends, particularly for practitioners who operate in the counterterrorism space, who don't really have the luxury space or time to be able to read across a diverse literature base, to read 40 articles focused on or more focused on terrorism trends. So really part of my goal in producing this report was to aggregate some of that literature, to analytically situate it, so the counterterrorism community has a resource that they can go to help better shape how we approach the moment, and also to inform our understanding of these different trends that are helping to shape the environment. The third reason why I wrote the report is because the more I thought about this idea of the compound era and the sort of compound framing, it just made sense to me. And I also believe that it better reflects the sort of compound idea, the mixed, messy, and intersectional security environment that exists all around us today. And so I thought it'd be useful to put it forward for that reason as well. So the compound era, what case am I making in the report? What is the compound era, and how should we think about it? Well, the case I make in the report is that the compound era is being driven and shaped by three primary characteristics. You can see these here on the slide. And so the first is that there's the issue of multiple priorities. So the US government for several years has been navigating multiple national security priorities. The 2018 National Security Strategy of the United States identified strategic competition as the US guiding light in terms of our core primary national security objective and priority. That makes sense. And frankly, that was probably somewhat overdue. And that same document also identifies terrorism as a persistent, but still important priority, but a lesser priority. And again, that also makes sense. And so there's this issue of multiple priorities, and all of us in the counterterrorism community in the US have been navigating sort of how counterterrorism fits within the realm of strategic competition. And even though across the US interagency, there's an appreciation for how strategic competition and counterterrorism as two different priorities can intersect and blend to be nested with one another. There's also a desire from the US side, which is somewhat understandable, to really put terrorism and the issue of terrorism in the sort of rear view mirror. Is that we're sort of terrorism fatigue, where we're as a priority, we're interested in moving on, and we want to move on and want to focus on issues like pacing threats from China and other state competitors. And all of that makes sense. But there's also a dynamic where sometimes we build these, try to bifurcate these two different problem sets and priorities, where strategic competition is one thing and counterterrorism is another. And we want to focus on strategic competition. We still care about counterterrorism, but we want to care about it less. And so when we think about strategic competition, sometimes, even though we know that there can be interactions and nesting between these two priorities, we want to focus on strategic competition more. And again, that makes sense. But part of the case that I make in the report is that counterterrorism is at its core about threat mitigation. And that's the primary way that we've thought about counterterrorism over the past 2 decades from the US side. And that will remain core to how we think about counterterrorism. But in looking back on the past 2 decades of the US experience in counterterrorism, one of the things I put forward in the piece is that I think it's also helpful to think about counterterrorism and how counterterrorism assistance in particular can also be useful as a form of influence. And so trying to change the sort of model of how we think about counterterrorism, and it's not just about threat mitigation, which is, we kind of all know that to some extent, but also providing, a pathway to think about counterterrorism as a form of influence. Because I think if we think about how counterterrorism as a domain area can be leveraged as a form of influence, can be beneficial to helping us to figure out the ways in which counterterrorism can be leveraged or be put in service of a strategic competition objectives that we have from the United States. For example, in various places around the world, while the U.S. Wants to move on from the issue of terrorism, terrorism is still an issue that many of our key partners care about deeply, and in many cases, it's still a core strategic threat that they face. And so, over the past 2 decades, the U.S. has developed this counterterrorism expertise, which is a form of currency for the United States to help us build trust with partners. And so I think as we're sort of navigating this moment of multiple priorities, the need to sort of look across the boundaries of these two different problems and to really think carefully and critically about how we can leverage counterterrorism assistance as a way to accomplish other objectives for the United States in the strategic competition arena. The second pillar that's helping to shape the compound era of U.S. counterterrorism is that today we face a broad and diverse range of terrorism and extremist threats. I think we all recognize this and just sort of need to look in the news, and with the work that the GTAC does and the threats that it monitors, this is, I'm sure, at the forefront of their thinking as well. And if we had to bucket these different threat areas, they fit into a couple different areas, right? So we have what could be characterized as mainstay terrorism threats, particularly from jihadist organizations like Al Qaeda and the Islamic State and their different networks that are active around the globe. The external threats from groups like Al Qaeda and the Islamic State have been diminished, but in a local and regional context in certain places, these groups are also still very active. And there's also the sort of enduring and persistent threat that in the absence of pressure being placed on them, that they may be able to rebuild their external operations capability. Another core area that we need to think about, and that is a key issue when it comes to extremism and terrorism, is the sort of universe of actors for transnational far-right and domestic extremism here in the United States, which includes accelerationist groups, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, white supremacist groups, organizations or networks motivated by other far-right or far-left extremist causes, idiosyncratic terrorism. We also have the issue of state-sponsored terrorism, because the rise of strategic competition and greater emphasis on that, is also pushing states to work through proxies. And we're seeing that play out in different localities around the globe, and particularly related to threats posed by Iran and organizations and proxies that the Iranian government supports. The third pillar that forms the sort of basis of the compound era is that today we're also face a more mixed counterterrorism landscape. And that over the past 2 decades, due to technological change and open access to technology, there has been a rise in the number of stakeholders or players who are either have been meaningfully shaping or have a role in the world of counterterrorism and how specific counterterrorism actions or responses take place. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the remarks here in a minute. So counterterrorism trends. The report highlights 6 trends. These are not the only trends that exist that are shaping the world of terrorism and extremism, but these are 6 that I thought were some of the most important and the ones that we really need to think carefully about. These trends in the report are not necessarily new. They've been going on for a while. But again, I thought it was helpful to spotlight them so we could think carefully about them. The first pertains to the issue of span, and that today the United States and its partners need to determine ways to proactively manage and confront the threat posed by a more diverse, geographically diffuse, and complex array of extremists. The challenge of span cuts across international and domestic terrorism threats. For example, on the international front, one only needs to look at the number, density, and diversity of terror groups in regions like Africa or the Afghanistan-Pakistan border areas with different backgrounds, ideologies, operational preferences, and connections to appreciate the challenge of span. But the issue of span is also an issue that we need to think about on the domestic front too. And I found recent comments that Nick Rasmussen, the Department of Homeland Security's CT coordinator, remarks that he made at a recent event at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy this summer, where he talked about how the threat of domestic terrorism is no longer more of an urban or major city problem, but is an issue that now cuts across urban, suburban, and rural. For example, in the first several years or decade after 9/11, when we thought about terrorism threats in the United States, there was concern about terrorist attacks again in New York or in Washington, D.C., or maybe in L.A. But now in the environment that we're in, we need to think about terrorism threats in Buffalo at a supermarket, or at El Paso at a Walmart, or in San Bernardino. And so it sort of cuts across and is an issue that we need to think about. The second trend that the report highlights deals with structure and form. And another core complicating factor is that today's extremist and terrorism threats manifest in different organizational forms and derive their support, and in some cases capabilities, by leveraging different approaches, such as attacks that are remotely encouraged or enabled from afar. One ongoing trend and point of debate in the terrorism studies field has been this issue of decentralization. Some have argued that we have entered a post-organizational phase of extremism, and others have even gone so far as to state that terrorism today is a result of swarm dynamics based upon online interactions, and that organization and groups no longer matter a great deal. The view that one has on this issue, how decentralized or centralized threats are these days, depends upon the different threats or communities that they're assessing. But if we look across different extremists and terrorist communities and threat streams, it becomes apparent that while decentralization is real and is a thing and it is a trend, the broader challenge that the U.S. counterterrorism community faces is that today's terror threats rely on and span across a spectrum of organizational form. For example, movements like the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda still embrace organizational structure and form to a great degree, but they also operate in a decentralized way and try to motivate attacks from afar from individuals who are inspired by these groups and networks to conduct attacks when they have no direct connections to them, to sort of conduct attacks in their name. Then we have entities like the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys that, while decentralized in part, they also embrace more forms of hierarchy than other domestic extremists like accelerationists. Then we have the challenge of individuals that cut across these organizational preferences. For the counterterrorism community, these dynamics create detection challenges and make it hard for counterterrorism practitioners to gain analytical or operational efficiencies across threat streams. And that's a really challenging issue because the U.S. counterterrorism enterprise is, with counterterrorism being an enduring priority, but a lesser of a priority these days, is that that's also impacted the resources that the counterterrorism community has. And so there's this sort of issue of there's more complexity on the threat side and the need to sort of know more and learn more while there are less resources and personnel to do that. The third and fourth trend areas that the report discusses deal with participatory dynamics and movement across the terrorism worlds. I found that analytically presenting these two trend areas was the most difficult part of the paper to write, just because there's a lot of crossover and bleed over. And so I took my shot at how we can perhaps usefully think about these issues. There are probably other useful ways or frameworks to use, and my hope is that the report helps to spur some of that debate. The first trend area pertains to a number of dynamics and practices that have become more common in recent years that are shaping how individuals can engage with extremist ideas, associate their individual acts of violence, and make their own idiosyncratic terrorism their own. These dynamics include how interactive, momentum-based, and customizable certain acts of terrorism can be these days. The arc of this trend can be seen in looking across far-right attacks from the 2011 attacks in Norway to the 2019 attacks in Christchurch, New Zealand, as well as the El Paso attack that same year, to the more recent 2020 attack in Buffalo, New York, and how those attackers were all unique in terms of their own motivations, but how those attacks have also been linked as a sort of common canon or corpus of attacks that are all helping to inspire and build upon one another. These participatory dynamics are helping to drive the pace and impact of threats. Another related trend area, which is the fourth one that's also pushing terrorism threats in new directions, are the fluid and intersectional dynamics that have been occurring across the world of extremism. We see these fluid and organizational dynamics at play in a lot of different areas. For example, far-right and jihadist extremists have been observing, learning from, borrowing aesthetics, and in some ways interacting with one another online. On the slide here, you can see some examples of that, which are also available in the report. And while there are still barriers that make direct cooperation between these different extremist spheres unlikely, they have also recognized that there are areas where they have shared enemies and goals, with some even suggesting that maybe there are areas and ways in which they could partner or collaborate. And here you see in the slide the sort of pragmatic collaboration there on the right, just one example of that. These dynamics strongly suggest that in the near future, we're going to see more idiosyncratic forms of terrorism, and that we could see the emergence of some surprising and unique threat coalitions. The next trend that the report discusses deals with speed and the issue of potential scale. Today's terrorism landscape is being shaped by the accessibility of extremist content and the greater normalization or mainstreaming of such content, particularly in the United States. And this has led to two important and troubling effects. First, the internet has sped up the time it takes for an individual to radicalize. There's been a lot of great work that's been done at the University of Maryland at START by Michael Jensen that looks at this issue from a data and empirics perspective. And for practitioners, this means that they have less time to identify individuals operating across a distributed array of digital platforms who have radicalized, and less time to discern which individuals do and do not pose a threat. So the issue of speeds is a pretty core one. Second is the issue that hate and us versus them discussions have become a more regular feature of public discourse in the United States. And that extremist discourse has become increasingly mainstreamed in the United States. Polls and academic research have highlighted American concerns about the increased danger of politically motivated violence and how Americans' acceptance of political violence has been rising. Dynamics which suggest that ongoing normalization of hate is likely to lead to more real-world violence. There are a bunch of different metrics or measures that we can look at to see this, how the rise in hate is leading to acts of violence and also the threat of future acts of violence. For example, for the past several years, the U.S. Capitol Police has been tracking historically high levels of threats made to members of Congress and their families. A study recently published by the Counterterrorism Institute, Insight, out in Nebraska, has documented a similar rise in threats to public officials. And according to the FBI, there has been a rise in annual hate crime incidents across time as well, that those have been generally rising. There's also the chart that you see here on the screen. It's in front of you that highlights the rise in the acceptance of political violence amongst American partisans on both sides, which is rather shocking. These various data points paint a picture of how hate and division being on the rise, or at least not falling down or being less of an issue, dynamics which do not bode well for the potential for extremism and terrorism in this country. The sixth area that the report talks about, trend area, is also a fairly obvious one, but I think it's also an area that deserves a bit more scrutiny and thought, is how technology remains a key locus of competition between terrorists and counter-terrorists, and how technology functions to both enable and constrain terrorism. Access to technology has the power to create new opportunities and challenges for all actors, and as a result, it remains a key area where extremists and counter-extremists compete to identify weaknesses and or gain an advantage. The existence of this competitive space is not new, but the characteristics of the space have been changing, and changing in ways that lower barriers to entry and enhance the ability of non-state actors to develop new advantages, overcome power imbalances, and innovate. The open technological revolution that Dr. Audrey Kurth Cronin has identified in her great book has also been reshaping the worlds of counterterrorism and intelligence. Not only has it broadened the array of commercial technologies and capabilities to which security practitioners have access, it has also been shifting the number, type, and diversity of actors and stakeholders operating in the counterterrorism space, and the dynamics of who designs, manages, owns, or has access to or influence over specific platforms and approaches. Since the pace and scale of technological change is projected to only increase over the next several decades, it's likely that these issues will only become more profound and complicated and require more collaboration partnerships across the world of counterterrorism, not less. Just one snapshot for you that's reflected here in the slide to paint a picture of how the counterterrorism landscape is changing. One small example of that is to look at an organization like GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism, founded in 2017 with 4 members. At the end of 2022, it grew to 22 members. And so, these are all technology companies like Meta and Facebook, Twitter, or X now, companies like Snap and Discord that all have their own policies and approaches to counterterrorism. And you think about something like, and again, just like a tangible example about how the counterterrorism world is changing and has changed, is the issue of like live streaming of attacks, where that's an area where the government has a very little role to play in preventing those, extremists or terrorists from leveraging that type of technology, particularly when it happens. They can notify, they can, put pressure on these companies, they can subpoena records, after the fact to help in the prosecution of particular individuals or networks. But the companies themselves are the ones that are governing and have their own policies and approaches to deal with that at an individual level. And then there's an organization like GIFCT, which is an umbrella organization that helps to guide their activity in a collective way. The rest of the report, third part of it, as I mentioned, focuses on 11 different priority or focus areas that I recommend that the U.S. government place emphasis on during this period to help sort of shape its new chapter of counterterrorism, this new era. I won't get into the details of these. I could spend a lot of time talking about each and every one of them. They're here on the slide. I'd be happy to talk about any of them that you may be interested in. I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Don, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. A lot of things to think about here. I have a question for you, and then I would ask everybody else, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. To me, it's this complacency word, which has been used a lot in the recent days. And those of us who are working in GTAC day in and day out and processing data, whether it be our data analysts or our validators or those folks that parse the data, we're not seeing much of an diminution of terrorism. In fact, quite the opposite. And let's park the horrific October the 7th incident for the moment. We're seeing Africa collapsing in the Sahel, and that's going to have an impact on the United States eventually. Maybe not immediately, but those governments are, such as they are failing. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there are strategic interests of the United States. I'm not convinced, having spent a good chunk of my career in Latin America, I'm not convinced that all is well in Colombia, and that's going to have an impact on the United States. We're seeing an uptick, a serious uptick in Pakistan. So it worries me to hear a little bit that we're making strategic choices and we're going to focus on state actors while we're not perhaps investing enough time and attention in what the data is telling us. And I will just pivot quickly back to the incidents in Israel, which is, without doubt, their 9/11. I mean, our data is showing us that there was a significant uptick in 2023 before October the 7th in incidents in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Now, whether that's indicative of, something is about to happen or not, I don't know. But it to hear that we're making strategic choices, I guess, is a little frustrating, and it concerns me that we might be taking our eye off the ball.
Yeah, I think those are all fair comments, and I think that that's where I was with this report, trying to hit it, the intersectionality of how strategic competition and terrorism can fit together, and how it'd be helpful to think about them. And and again, there's in a lot of different ways, it's important that we maintain these boundaries between these two different problem sets, and how we think about them, because they're not always blended or mixed. But you mentioned the Sahel, and I think that's an area where for many, or a number of countries in that area, that terrorism is a core strategic problem that they care about. That is their primary threat that they are concerned about. And I think that for the U.S., that provides an opportunity, right, where counterterrorism, and the U.S. needs to make calculations of who we want to have as a counterterrorism partner, and who we do not, given the nature of certain regimes and dynamics in particular countries. But I think that with this idea of counterterrorism being a form of currency, that we shouldn't overlook counterterrorism as a method of to help us with the issue of strategic competition. I also think, and your point about looking at the data resonates with me, because I do feel as though, and there has been a debate about this across the sort of counterterrorism community, and people taking different positions on this, is just how the external or transnational threat of terrorism from groups like Al Qaeda, the Islamic State, which is or threat to attacks against the homeland or U.S. interest abroad, which in the realm of prioritizing terrorism threats in this environment that we're in is a core thing that is guiding U.S. counterterrorism at the moment. That makes sense. But at the same time, there are also, as sort of I think you're mentioning, the number and the amount of the number of organizations that are active, their operational tempo, things that they're doing, their ability to overthrow states and to influence the direction of things in particular areas or countries, is absolutely concerning. And so just because it doesn't present an immediate or direct international, transnational terrorism threat at the moment, doesn't mean that it's not a priority, or that it shouldn't be a priority, or something that we shouldn't care about. And at the same time, it also, in certain areas of the world, I think we need to think about how counterterrorism can be leveraged, and counterterrorism assistance as a tool. I think about places like, in addition to Africa, that one of the cases that stands the most to me is a country like the Philippines, where U.S. counterterrorism assistance to the Philippines has been a bedrock form of partnership with the Filipino government, between the U.S. and the Philippines, and that's in sort of such a geostrategically important area when we talk about China, and so I think that it would be helpful moving forward, in my opinion, to look at the data with as clear eyes as we can, not run from the data, particularly terrorism data, and think about how we might want to adjust our approaches, given what that data is telling us. Just because, we might want to transition from terrorism, I still think that there's a need to be honest about what that data is telling us. So that's shared from where we sit at CTC.
Okay. The next question is, and these are all very much connected. You made a very interesting point on how CT can be used to leverage the US position in its strategic competition with other superpowers. Can you please elaborate more on this in terms of the recent attacks by Hamas and the evolving conflicts in Africa?
Yeah, when it comes to the Hamas attack, we're still early days about what we're learning about this incident, and there's been different strands of reporting about the attack and the potential assistance, or depending upon what sources one believes, the role that Iran did or did not play in relation to this attack. I mean, it's clearly clear, and there's a lot of evidence to support that the Iranian government, provides support to Hamas and has provided support to Hamas. And so, I think this is an area where you do see the direct connection between the issue of counterterrorism and strategic competition, where, I think that when it comes to how we can approach that issue or support the Israeli government to deal with that issue, there's obviously a confluence there. How to think about it when it comes to Africa. I think another thing I would offer here is just that, again, thinking about counterterrorism as a form of influence, I think that's a helpful framework. I also think that when we look at a country like China, I think that there's a bunch of evidence to indicate and suggest that China has also been leveraging counterterrorism and recognizes that counterterrorism is a form of influence for itself as well. And so it seems to be the case. We haven't done the full data picture on this from CTC, but it seems like China has been more active in the counterterrorism space. And so, the U.S. needs to think carefully about who it wants to partner with in different countries and locations around the world. But sometimes there's also this competitive dynamic in the counterterrorism sphere where in Africa is a good example in certain ways where if the U.S. isn't willing to provide assistance, countries like Russia or China are. And the U.S. might have a certain logic and reasons why they don't want to provide counterterrorism assistance to a certain country, and isn't to suggest that we should, if there's a need, that we should fill it, because we need to be careful about these things. But there is a competitive dynamic at the strategic competition level where different models of counterterrorism are sort of emerging, where the U.S. wants to ally itself, given our principles, with regimes and governments that are more democratically oriented, or at least hold that potential. Whereas other governments have looked to a country like China, who's going to ask less questions when it comes to counterterrorism, and they're providing this alternative model. And so that's where this is sort of shaping and playing out in places like Africa and in other parts of the globe. So I think, we obviously need to keep a pulse on it. On the Hamas thing, frankly, I wish I had a better question. I think it's early. It is an intersectional issue. I think we really need to learn more about the potential role that Iran did or did not play with respect to this incident. It seems like there's evidence that it did, or at least it by providing support to Hamas, helped to enable it. So I think we'll see how that one plays out, and I'm hesitant to sort of jump more into that question, that aspect of the question, just because I think there's still a lot we don't know.
Fair enough. I mean, just to go back to the previous question, of course, the Wagner Group is alive and well in many of those countries in the Sahel. So another question, this is definitely coming from one of our analysts. Actually, it's coming from Dr. Chingiz. You mentioned how jihadist attacks, either by ISIS or Al Qaeda, have diminished over the years and come back to our data. We're very proud of our data, as you can tell. We recorded 9,500 terrorist attacks by those two organizations from 2018 to 22. So both groups are the perpetrators of around 2,000 attacks every year. Despite declining numbers and the attention on jihadist groups, do you think we should see it as a serious threat for the US and world security?
I think it's helpful to look at these numbers and the question here in relation to different components of the threat. And so in my remarks, I was focusing on transnational external terrorism threat posed by the Islamic State and Al Qaeda. And there has been a diminished threat and activity from both of those organizations when we look at the data or threat that these organizations pose through that lens. So that's like one piece of it, is like from a US lens of the threat of external operations, transnational terrorism, attacks against the US homeland from these networks, that, you know, in the sort of prioritization framework that the US is pursuing, is the first way that the data is being looked at. The question also, so that's like one lens to look at the data in terms of like what type of threat these organizations pose. And I think that my personal view is I think the data there, at least for the time period, is fairly clear. And obviously it can be a changing picture. I think it's also helpful to look at the data, which I think is sort of implied in the question, through a regional and localized lens. And so in some cases, while the threat of transnational external terrorism, again, from a US perspective, is diminished, there has been a rise in activity and attacks by certain networks and group, Islamic State and Al Qaeda affiliated in specific countries and specific regions over the past several years. Or there have been ebbs and flows in that data with a sort of steady, not steady, or just at least a rise of behavior across a broader longitudinal frame of time. I think that issue is a concerning one from a regional security perspective, particularly if some of these organizations are able to topple governments or seize and hold terrain. Because when we have the issue, as we saw, you know, historically in places like Afghanistan or in Syria during the heyday of the Islamic State, is that things can get quite dangerous if terrorist organizations are given the opportunity to not be under pressure and to have the opportunity to expand and experiment. You know, and to get at this issue of like, while obviously from a US perspective, those issues and developments are concerning from a regional perspective, with the potential to, you know, for violence to become even more of an issue across certain regions of the globe. I think one core thing that we need to think about and pay attention to is enhancing our understanding of these movements and networks, what they care about. And that's where I think that it's important, you know, you guys live in the world of data at your center, to look at issues like the aggregated trends of like, okay, these pictures don't paint a good number. And particularly if they're continue to rise or if they're at a sustained level. But then there's also the importance of the outlier cases of, all right, what are those cases, and honing in on them early to say, and again, approaching this from a US lens of, when are these organizations, are they interested in issues of broader regional terrorism? Are they interested in issues of showing signs of transnational terrorism? Because in the world that we live in terms of how the US is trying to prioritize terrorism threats, that sort of prioritization matrix is guiding things. I do think that you know, there is a case to be made that regional instability over time, while not precisely, you know, a direct threat to the United States, if left, to just continue, can evolve into a situation that can present a lot of security challenges to the United States and our partners. And it seems like that in certain locations, the Sahel being one of them, that is an issue that continues to build. And so, one key challenge for the United States is to figure out who we can partner with to help manage and mitigate those threats. And that's an imperfect world because of some of the limitations of certain partners in certain areas of the world. So yes, it's a concern. I think the administration has made the decision that it's going to be place more emphasis on the transnational sort of international terrorism piece, or threats against the homeland or direct threats to U.S. interests, and that it's perhaps will be hesitant to invest a little more until it bubbles up to an area where it's a broader direct threat to the United States. So hopefully that's helpful as a response to, I think that's an important question.
Excellent. We have time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to try and combine one here because I think it's really important and near and dear to my heart. So, often the law of unintended consequences, U.S. or other foreign interventions creates tension, and which can help increase or bolster the counterterrorism landscape in particular communities, countries, areas. And I don't know whether this is a relationship to what you're talking about here in terms of focus area 5, but it seems to me that much more work with civil society organizations and groups on the ground to help mitigate some of these things is really important. I'm currently working with a small NGO in Mali to try and see what we can do to help them get some resources to start working on the victims of terror interventions, either widows or others. So how can we pivot away from just strong arm military intervention to at the same time working with on the softer side or softer USAID approach, I guess?
Yeah, both are important questions. On the first one about engaging with civil society and sort of focusing less on the sort of harder side of counterterrorism, I think that in my view dovetails with the second recommendation that I made, is sort of being honest about and transparent about the U.S. counterterrorism and sort of the track record over the past 2 decades. And I think that one of the guiding principles for U.S. counterterrorism has been this logic of leadership decapitation, and in certain ways, to remove or capture key leaders from, say, the Islamic State or Al Qaeda, typified by Operation Against Ayman al-Zawahiri or Osama bin Laden, and those operations are important, but I think that they also tell us, given how we've seen things play out, is that those approaches are useful, but they are useful in buying strategic space and time, because these organizations are resilient and they endure. And one of the analogies that a friend shared with me a long time ago was that when it comes to counterterrorism, it's helpful. The U.S. places a lot of emphasis on what could be characterized as like the players. If we were to have like a baseball analogy of like, the players are on the field and they come and go as the team evolves, right? And so you take out one player, another player comes in, maybe he's not as good, but then eventually over time gains some skills and also becomes a good player. So the players move, and then the teams also come and go, but that this individual is making the case that U.S. counterterrorism really needs to focus more on the league, or sort of like the league that helps to sustain the teams and the players, and that gets at the sort of civil society issues and the broader issues that help to sustain certain movements in various countries or regions around the world. And those are hard and tricky things to do. But as we are in this moment of transition, and this is actually spelled out in what we are able to learn of current U.S. counterterrorism strategy. There was a document that the New York Times released called National Security Memorandum 13, which actually called attention to this issue and said that we are going to place less emphasis on military solutions to counterterrorism and place more emphasis on other approaches. And so that's already an area that the government's thinking about. One area that, and this is sort of gets to the other question about Focus Area 5 and the importance of partnerships. One area and partnership that's been important for myself and us at the Combating Terrorism Center. One of the threads of my research I focused on terrorist interest and use of drones, so unmanned aerial systems. And to learn more about that issue, we reached out to weapons tracking NGOs that are active and have deployed personnel in places like Iraq and Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia. So you have these non-governmental actors that are in the field, that after a military operation has been conducted or there's an attack, that they go in and they're looking at the components that are left and doing the hard work of trying to figure out how that device or that component got into theater, and sort of retracing it back. And so, to me, that's one example of partnerships where there's mutual interests, say between weapons tracking an NGO like that in terms of the work that they do and the knowledge that they have and expertise that they have, and the expertise that whether it's the US or European governments have in the counterterrorism space. And there's opportunities to learn lessons from one another, to share data, to help impact or affect some of these issues and problems when it comes to terrorism technology in the field. Another way to think about counterterrorism partnerships in this moment is that to develop partnerships, it's helpful to think about trust. And I think that, and this is outlined actually in the ODNI's recent strategy document, focused on, their vision for where they want to head for partnerships, and that they need to engage more with different actors across society. So there's this broad recognition from the ODNI side that this needs to happen. But I think that, there also needs to be an appreciation for different forms of expertise where, I'll give you an example. Does the US government have individuals, even if only to learn, right, to embedded or at a place like TikTok or Discord or Twitch, right, to go and learn from these other expertise communities who engage in different components of extremism, terrorism, hate, and to filter some of those approaches, to build those relationships and filter some of that knowledge back to how the US government can or cannot engage in that space. And naturally, for certain companies like that, they may not want to have those partnerships or relationships. But I guess, I think it's helpful to think about how we might approach these through a bigger tent, and through when it comes to expertise. Because I think that what I've observed is that because of the downsizing of or right sizing of counterterrorism in the United States and with European partners, that there's a need to build more bridges governmentally across society. And there's a lot of different ways that the counterterrorism community can do that. And I think that part of that is by personal opinion, the US government getting more comfortable sharing information and data and expertise and personnel with other partners. And that's something that I think the intelligence community recognizes, but that it's a bit hesitant to often do. One example of this is that the CTC, in our monthly publication, the CTC Sentinel, recently published an article written by the National Counterterrorism Center senior analysts, And that's the first time that they've done that. And so kudos to NCTC for, being willing to do that in an open way that isn't just congressional testimony. And so hopefully we see more of that. But there is a danger as counterterrorism becomes less of a priority and potentially even lesser of a priority, is that approaches that aim to build a bigger tent don't happen. And so that, at least from my personal view, we need to integrate more. We need to collaborate more across, up and down and across. That's a lot. I'll stop there, but I could talk for an hour about the partnerships piece, but I think that gives you a sense of hopefully a useful response to that question.
Don, I'm going to end it there. We do have a couple more questions, but I would suggest those folks reach out to you by email, or I can forward them to you, and you can respond to them and as you are able. Like to thank you very much for an excellent presentation and the time you took to answer most of the questions that we had. I think it was very useful, especially in the current context. And I really hope that we can broaden our dialogue between the CTC and what we're doing at GTAC. I think it would be good for both organizations. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your presentation and your time, and I would like to thank all of those who are listening in for your time and your attention and the quality questions. So stay tuned. We hope to have another few of these before the end of the year, and look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Don. Take care.